And welcome to another edition of the Nerdy Agent Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Pedersen, with my brothers and fellow nerds, Josh and AJ. We are going to try and get through this podcast without the allergies interrupting us this time.
Great job not sneezing on the intro. That was good.
Oh my gosh, they're killing me today. This week, we're going to talk about one of the hot button topics as far as the economy goes and the presidential changes. We're going to talk about tariffs and what tariffs are so you understand what the outcomes of if the tariff policy goes into effect and how that might affect us in the real estate industry. So to start, what is a tariff? Let's start super basic so people understand.
Oh, sure. Looking at the econ guy. A tariff is basically a tax on goods that you import into the United States or into the country of wherever it's going to be sold in most of the time.
Yeah, the thought behind them is there are sometimes advantages given by foreign governments to create products at a rate and sell them at a rate that then disadvantages local producers. And so, and there's more global trade policy and whatever you want to call it in terms of countries competing with other countries, stuff going on. But it's mostly driven around the fact that you want to make sure that local companies are not being disadvantaged in a way that doesn't allow them to be successful. So you tax foreign goods coming in, and thus they become more expensive to sell in the local market, making it a fairer fight locally for the companies that produce here.
And historically, because we did place tariffs, like 6 years ago we put some tariffs?
During the last Trump administration, tariffs. So there was a tariff war kind of thing. I mean, it was like a pissing match, but yeah, the general gist of it was China and the U.S. kept going back and forth tariffing. And at the end of the day, I guess that the thought process, once again, was the administration felt that making American products be first was the goal, or a more protectionist approach. And that then, led to a little bit of inflation through the process. It creates some impacts in terms of exports as well, because if we're tariffing another country, they may tariff the stuff that we send to them, thus making it maybe more complicated from some local producers to sell outside of the United States. But locally, what it is, the fear is beyond it in terms of how this, why are we talking about this today, is if tariffs become a much larger portion of the strategy that we are incorporating politically, that could lead to products becoming more expensive, because stuff that's being shipped in to the United States cheaply, the reason why it's being shipped in cheaply today is because it's cheaper than the stuff that we can produce locally. And so if something moves from, say, being produced in China at a very cheap rate to now being produced in the United States at a higher rate because our cost of services is higher, our cost of materials is higher,
more regulation,
we don't have necessarily subsidies that are making things cheaper for us to produce, et cetera. That will lead to price increases. So a lot of the corporations have already said that if tariffs come in and costs go up, they're not just going to eat that cost and minimize their profits. They're going to pass that through to consumers. So that could lead to increases in inflation, which has been a hot button topic now for a number of years. It has been the largest thing that we've talked about in terms of how mortgage rates are ultimately impacted through the kind of the funnel of how things work.
I've also seen a lot of stuff around, let's just say China's importing X good. All of a sudden we put a tariff on that. They're in China also, so local producers are not just going to eat the cost. They're not going to as well. They just raise their price to offset whatever that is.
Unless they're already disadvantaged. So let's say solar panels was a good example, right? In China, they can be produced for much cheaper than they can in the United States. So therefore, slapping a tariff on it almost makes it so they're at the same cost of goods. That's kind of the goal locally. So it won't necessarily drive up the price comparatively to the local producer, but the cost of the final thing is going to increase because someone's buying that and selling it at a markup today.
And so long term, let's just say that does happen. So that increases inflation. That affects what the Fed is going to do on the back end based on all the reports.
Well, I mean, you could even say, and I can stop talking, AJ can jump in at some point here, but we've already seen since the election announcement in terms of how the transition is going to happen, who won, et cetera. Tariffs are now more in the mindset of investors, and we've seen the 10-year Treasury rise as a result of expectations. And so the day of the election, the stock market went nuts, but the 10-year went nuts at the same time, which is a little unique. And I guess it was more so driven by this belief that if tariffs happen, inflation is likely going to increase. Therefore, The Fed's behavior is likely to be less aggressive in terms of reducing rates because the Fed has been tasked with protecting inflation. And thus, we're now seeing, mortgage rates go up actually as a result of the belief that tariffs will be more a part of this administration's policies than the prior administration's.
Yeah, I mean, and I've read lots of things on this. I studied this in college. I'm now looking at a bunch of tax foundations, wealth managers, international economic institutes, and they basically took, what the potential tariffs might be, which really the ones that are being spelled out is a 10% universal tariff. So anybody imports anything, it's 10%. Unless it's from China, then it's 60%. And unless it's from Mexico, then it's somewhere between 25 and 100%. Which is, it's a fascinating concept and idea. And you think about, larger items such as, cars, for instance. If it costs Honda 10% more to get their car here, then presumably, to Luke's point, it probably costs 10% more to purchase that car. And so it not only makes cars more expensive, but it makes the American ones more attractive. That's kind of the goal. But by and large, all of these smart people have said you're going to see, depending on what kind of tariffs we end up putting in place. I mean, if they do put in the 10% and then 60 to China, most of them are saying somewhere between 0.5% and 2.5% of a reduction in GDP, which is also not great for the economy, obviously, as you'd like to be growing, and is one of the indicators of a recession. But we've talked a lot about this Fed policy, and we could get ourselves into a sticky spot if we have rates high and recession happening with inflation, because there's not a whole lot that the Fed can do to recover from that.
But I think as you think about this from a real estate agent standpoint, because we're trying to take politics out of it in terms of our own personal beliefs. So I would be just watching the news surrounding this concept, right? So whether or not you agree with it, disagree with it, think it's a good idea, think it's a terrible idea, watch the news around it in terms of how it starts playing out as the new administration comes into place, because it will be something that will continue to trickle through to mortgage rates via the 10-year and via how the 10-year impacts mortgage rates. So just read articles about this as you see things that pop up in the news. Try to figure out what's actually going to happen, because there are going to be some interesting things at play there. To AJ's point, if it does align with the new administration's discussion talking points about trying to put America first, but there's also this component of the economy being the number one thing that voters vote on. And so theoretically, there would be some discretion around how much wants to be done to potentially create negative economic implications for people, because that could, especially in the first year, put a sour taste in a number of people's mouths and maybe make them feel differently about the decisions they made on election day.
And I think that if you boil it down to be as basic and simple as possible, a lot about what we talk about on this podcast is, yes, you should understand the in-depth, you should understand all this stuff, but being able to just take small tidbits and use it to I don't want to say just sound better, but actually be an expert in the real estate industry, opposed to providing low level of service and not having the knowledge to be an expert. Just understanding that the economic researchers and the people who are predicting what could happen based on what different presidents choose to do are saying that if we put tariffs that are this aggressive into place, that will likely lead to an increase in inflation. An increase in inflation, as you do know after listening to this podcast, historically means that the 30-year ends up being higher, because they want to see inflation come down. And if inflation doesn't come down, the Fed's not going to do the things that typically indirectly will lead to the reduction of the 30-year interest rate.
And what's interesting too, though, is to follow, and maybe this is just due to election and more quote-unquote certainty moving forward, is that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate versus the 10-year Treasury yield, that spread is something that we talk about often.
Yep.
It hovered between 1.5 to 2 for most of the 2010 decade, and then notably peaked at like over 3, probably sometime last year, I think, where you were seeing 4.2 10-year yields and 7.3 30-year fixed interest rates. Right now, That's actually come down quite a bit.
Yep.
We're seeing that number hovering right around 2.5. So while we have a 10-year that's higher than it was last year when rates were 7.3, the Mortgage News Daily is kicking out a number of like 6.9 today. So you're seeing those spreads start to squeeze down, which I think, and maybe you guys can have an opinion on this, but I think that typically is happening when there's a little more certainty in what's going to happen moving forward, because they feel like they can be more competitive on pricing for that longer paper.
Well, they're projecting out where the market's going to go in the future, right? So if there's like during the high inflation period that was post-COVID and during COVID or post-COVID, there was just a lot of, no one really knew where the CPI was going to come in, right? There was just so little about how inflation was going to come in. So we didn't know if the Fed was going to raise rates or lower rates or whatever, whereas now we're getting a lot more certainty around that. This concept of tariffs in the new administration, I think, could breed some new uncertainty, because this is kind of a pump the brakes for the Fed moment. If the old administration kind of stayed in place, you would think theoretically they would have said, well, things will continue kind of on the path they've been on. But now we're introducing a new variable. So it'll be interesting to see really just how aggressively the tariff concept goes into place in January. Because I think that could, I don't say unwind, but it could impact that spread and or just the level of where the CPI numbers start coming in and how Powell and the Fed decide to move. But they've shown us historically, specifically in the last few years, that they are going to be really, really conservative in how they make their decisions and how they speak about these things. So I would imagine that you'll continue to hear like Powell speaking out of both sides of his mouth, saying things like, well, this might happen, so we might be a little bit more cautious, or the numbers look good, but they may not look as good in the future. He's always trying to kind of minimize the impact of anything that he's saying in terms of how it's then flowing through to the markets.
When is the next Fed meeting and or next time he speaks?
Didn't they just meet like last week?
Yeah, last week.
Oh, they did?
So it'll be a little while.
Was it before or after
right after the election?
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
Did he talk?
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be a good one to go find and listen to.
Yeah.
For anybody who wants to, and that's going to be probably a couple months till they meet again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that's all we have this week on the Nerdy Agent Podcast. That one was pretty nerdy. I would say we really went into the nerdiness this week. And as always, remember, be better